So my name is Ilya Levine. I'm co-chair of the Department of Politics and European Studies. This is our second session about Bulgaria's unusual flat tax and about the flat tax more generally. We have a couple of great panelists, one local, one coming from across the Atlantic. Our first panelist is Dan Mitchell. He's a public policy economist in Washington, D.C., doing research on all things tax. He holds a PhD in economics from the George Mason University. He was a senior fellow with the Cato Institute for 11 years and spent nearly 17 years as an economist at the Heritage Foundation. He's also the author of The Flat Tax, Freedom, Fairness, Jobs and Growth, and co-author of Global Tax Revolution. In addition, his work has been published in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Times, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Washington Post twice, a number of other newspapers, also Playboy. I'm assuming that was more text, not so much visuals, right? Yes. Okay. Did you know Playboy used to at least publish tax discussion? Wow, we really lost something there. He has also appeared on all the major networks, including CBS, NBC, ABC, CNN, Fox, CNBC, and C-SPAN. And also he founded the Center for Freedom and Prosperity and did a number of other things. Our other panelist is my dear colleague Momchil Karpuzanov. He's assistant professor of business administration and economics with us. He's also academic director of graduate programs at AUBG here. He holds a PhD in economics from Marseille Université in Aix-en-Provence in France. Did I do that right?
Aix-en-Provence, monsieur. Aix-en-Provence.
Years and years of high school French just paid off just now. His main areas of research are political economy, monetary economics, the currency board regime, the history of economic thought, and corruption. In addition to academic research, he has also conducted economic analysis for UNOPS, so that's part of the UN?
That's the United Nations Office for Project Services. It's the project service arm of, say, the UNDP, the way it started and now it serves the entire UN system.
Also the Ministry of the Economy and Invest Bulgaria Agency. So we're going to be talking about taxes, and there's the cliche saying about how there's two unavoidable things. Taxes are one of them, the other is death. We might be solving death because we're making, biotech is doing exciting things. Elon Musk is investing in all kinds of programs that have been trying to digitize, connect the brain to computers, so death might be solvable, but as a political scientist and a political economist, I'm actually less hopeful about solving the tax problem. Bulgaria is one of a relatively small number of countries that have a flat tax, so in Bulgaria you pay just 10% of your income in tax. No matter how much income you earn, right? This is quite unusual. So in a lot of Western countries, like where I'm from, there's a progressive tax system where the more you earn, the bigger percentage of your income you pay. And it's difficult to imagine New Zealand, for example, moving to a flat tax, again, politically, right? But it's important to have conversations about these things because there's always the possibility. What seems difficult at one particular point in time suddenly becomes very, very possible at another point in time. We'll start off with Dan providing us an overview of the topic of the flat tax in more general terms, and then perhaps we can get a more local perspective from Momchil. So Dan, if you could please just get us started.
Well, thank you very much. Just by way of background, I should explain that my article for Playboy was about Bill Clinton's economic policy. It was for the German edition. Unfortunately, I don't understand German, so all I can do is look at the pictures. In terms of the flat tax, I want to start with a very important caveat, which is that tax policy is just one part of fiscal policy. There's also government spending, as well as deficits and debt. And fiscal policy is just one part of overall economic policy. You have regulatory policy, trade policy, monetary policy. All these things are important in terms of seeing how well an economy or how not well an economy performs. And so you can have a country that has a very bad fiscal policy, but if they do really good laissez-faire policies in other areas, they'll probably be an economic success. I view Denmark as an example. Prosperous country, horrible tax system. But because they are so good and so market-oriented in every area other than fiscal policy, they are very successful. On the other hand, Russia, up until a few years ago, had a flat tax. And Russia obviously is not an economic superstar. Why? Because on all these other areas, they had a very bad tax system. And if we sort of now go back to just looking at taxes in isolation, keep in mind that a flat tax just usually refers to what's happening with the personal income tax. You have corporate taxes, you have social insurance taxes, you have value-added taxes. And if you look at the data for Bulgaria, I'm not going to be the expert on Bulgaria, but it's pretty easy to sort of look at international data on tax rates and where revenues come from in different countries. Bulgaria, okay, your flat tax is 10%. I like that, and I'll explain why in a second. But you have social insurance taxes that are 2.5 to 3 times that onerous for workers. And then you have a value-added tax of, I think it's 20% here? So whether the government is taxing your income when you earn it or whether the government is taxing your income when you spend it, it still winds up creating a wedge between your pre-tax income and your post-tax consumption. So when you're looking at incentives to be productive, to earn money, to be entrepreneurial, the things that sort of add to your nation's GDP and add to your personal income as well, you want to look at the totality of the tax system, and not only these tax rates that I just mentioned, but I don't know whether this is a major problem in Bulgaria, but in the United States, if you save and invest your after-tax income, you can be hit over and over again by things like the capital gains tax, the corporate income tax, the double tax on dividends, and we even have a death tax in the United States. So it's not just your statutory rates for personal income and corporate income, it's how many times is the government forcing you to run the same income through the tax system over and over and over again. And that's an area where the U.S. actually does worse than Europe, is this double and triple taxation of income that is saved and invested. Now, having given you all these caveats, let me now say why I think the flat tax is a good idea. Assuming you're talking about a pure Hall-Rabushka flat tax, Hall and Rabushka, two academics at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, who put together what is considered the pure version of the flat tax. What are the principles of that pure flat tax? Tax income only one time at one low rate with no loopholes, distortions, credits, exemptions, exclusions, and so on and so forth. The idea, the theoretical idea behind the flat tax is you want the government to minimize the damage imposed upon the economy via the tax collection process. In other words, whether you're collecting a little amount of money, which I prefer, or a lot of money, like others prefer, you want to try to collect that money while minimizing how much harm there's done to incentives to work, save, invest, be entrepreneurial. And I think virtually every economist will agree that that type of system minimizes the damage. Where you won't get agreement, though, is how much damage are you minimizing? Paul Krugman could be right here and say, well, yes, a flat tax will minimize the economic damage, but you're really only talking about a little bit of economic damage. On the other hand, I'll say you'll get a lot of economic benefits. In other words, the damage from a so-called progressive tax system, especially a progressive tax system that has all this double taxation of saving and investing, as well as a progressive tax system that has all sorts of distorting loopholes and preferences and exclusions, I'll say that the damage will be relatively significant. So economists usually don't disagree on the direction of a policy. What they'll disagree on is the magnitude of the policy. Are you losing 10% of GDP because of your tax system, or are you losing 2% of GDP because of your tax system? That fundamentally really is what the debate is all about. But having said that, let me give you what I would consider sort of the economic argument for the good parts of what a flat tax is designed to do. And there's nothing about, in America, a lot of the discussion about tax reform and the flat tax focuses on the fact that we have this very complicated tax system, 76,000 pages long, and with a flat tax, you rip all that up and you have two simple postcards. One postcard is for households to file their taxes. One postcard is for businesses to file their taxes. It doesn't matter whether you're the biggest company in the world or a hot dog stand, you file your taxes on a postcard. Doesn't matter if you're Bill Gates or the poorest person in the country, you file your taxes on a postcard. And it's very simple. Every family, there's an allowance based on family size for every household, and then you pay the flat rate above that. The postcard gets the most attention politically. People like it because it's a symbol of getting rid of all the corruption and complexity of our current tax code. But economically, frankly, the postcard doesn't matter. I mean, obviously it matters somewhat because of all the man hours that are wasted on complying with a very complex tax system. But in terms of the overall macroeconomic benefits of tax reform, the real benefits are from a low rate. And not only that, the real benefits are from getting rid of all the double taxation. Because, again, what did I say about the flat tax? Tax income only one time at one low rate with no loopholes. So you get benefits from the low rate, you get benefits from the elimination of double taxation. And by the way, why is that important? Every single economic theory, even socialism, even Marxism, every economic theory agrees you have to set aside some of today's income to finance tomorrow's growth. Now, the socialists they're a little bit silly. They think the government can do the investing and stuff like that. But every theory agrees that's how you generate long-run growth, is through capital formation. So stop penalizing through the tax code saving and investing. So that's how you get some economic growth, and then also getting rid of the distortions in the tax code. We do so many stupid things in America because the tax code bribes us to do stupid things. We overinvest in residential real estate compared to business investment. We have a terrible healthcare system driven in large part by the fact that income that you get from your employer in the form of fringe benefits like health insurance is tax-free. So instead of paying 15% payroll taxes and say maybe 28% income taxes on a certain tranche of income, if you get it in the form of a gold-plated health insurance policy, it's completely tax-free. And so we have this sort of all-you-can-eat buffet approach to healthcare with prepaid money, and so nobody cares, some people care because some people still pay out of pocket, but most Americans, when they buy healthcare, they're buying it with what they perceive to be other people's money. And when you're spending other people's money, you don't care about cost. You don't care about efficiency. And of course, if you're a healthcare provider, you take advantage of that by jacking up prices and building in all sorts of inefficiency. So the problems we have in our healthcare system, I'm digressing a bit, but it's really profoundly important in the context of U.S. Politics and policy. The problems in our healthcare system, in large part, are actually an artifact of the problems in our tax system. So you get rid of the loopholes like the fringe benefits exclusion, you get rid of the loopholes like the home mortgage interest deduction, and you get rid of the 75,980 pages of the tax code and have a simple 10-page tax system with 2 postcards. Again, the postcards don't drive the economic benefits. It's getting rid of all the loopholes and distortions and penalties and having one low rate. That's what generates prosperity with a flat tax. Now, it doesn't guarantee you'll be a rich country, because if you're making other mistakes, sort of returning back to where I started in the discussion, but why not take advantage of getting the biggest benefits you can by having a tax system that minimizes penalty? I'll close by simply noting that there are 2 major opponents of tax reform, at least in the United States. Outside of Washington, D.C., the big opponents are the proponents of class warfare. We should punish the rich simply because they're bad somehow. And the people who do that, the Bernie Sanders type politicians in America, I think they have a genuine misunderstanding of the world. They think the economy is a fixed pie. So if someone like Bill Gates is getting a big slice of pie, then the rest of us, by definition, are getting a small slice of pie. That is profoundly empirically inaccurate. The other opposition to the flat tax, and this is what we call inside the Beltway, in other words, in Washington, D.C., are all the special interest groups that benefit from the 75,980 pages that provide all the exclusions, exemptions, credits, deductions, and other special interest provisions in the tax code. I used to work for a senator who was the ranking senator on the tax writing committee. I can guarantee you that's what drives decision-making in Washington. It's what the special interests are doing. And so we have class warfare fights to overcome if we want tax reform, and we have special interest politics to overcome. And of course, this is why I will probably die someday, and the U.S. will still have a bad tax code. Thank you.
You know what, if we... So I guess there might be a solution to the death tax if we just avoid dying, but... They'll tax us for not dying.
There was a famous American humorist, Will Rogers, who said the only 2 things in life that are for sure are death and taxes, but only one gets worse every time the legislature meets.
Thank you. It's fascinating to get the broader strokes, and it's fascinating to hear about the American elements, how it's working or not working very well in the United States. Because for a lot of people outside of the United States, they tend to see the United States as a symbol of free market capitalism, right? And any dysfunctions that they spot in the United States, they kind of end up ascribing via, in part, gentlemen like Bernie Sanders, to the problems of and the dysfunctions of free market capitalism. So the American healthcare system, for example, that's seen as a free market healthcare system, and it looks very strange from an outside point of view. So it's interesting to hear how a lot of that is actually perhaps an unintended consequence of a series of decisions in tax policy. Momchil, perhaps we could hear a little bit from the more local perspective.
Thank you, and I like very much what Dan says about the fact that taxes in the fiscal system, and that's the income of the state speaking in general, of course. In the US, you have the federal government, state governments, the local counties, etc. In Bulgaria, we have a more centralized and, of course, somehow simpler system because of the lack of those different stratas of the administration and the administrative division across the country. But it is this flat tax that we have here in Bulgaria, not even a necessary, let alone a sufficient condition for wealth creation, for growth of the GDP, if this is the metrics we would rely upon to approximate for improvement and progress, economically speaking and socially speaking, etc. What is unusual about, and I have to compliment Ilya for this very, very opportune choice of words. What is unusual about the flat tax in Bulgaria is that it was brought on by a socialist government, right? So paradoxes everywhere. We used to say that the US and America was the land of freedom and unlimited possibilities. Bulgaria is not very far behind, in a slightly different manner. Yeah, the reason why the socialist government of Sergei Stanishev in the middle of 2006, those years, came up with the flat tax was manifold, none of which, not all of which I know of, but one of the main reasons is that they could afford it. Bulgaria was very quickly catching up in terms of growth of the GDP. So it was feasible from the standpoint of, just tying up the budget, so to speak, by politicians who didn't expect to run the country for very long. And obviously the historic record proved that they are no longer in office. But the second reason is that the state itself, the state administration didn't have the capacity, the administrative capacity to ensure that taxes are properly collected. So that suddenly simplified the whole process. And again, paradoxically, coming from a socialist government, we woke up with a flat tax of 10%. Now, put aside the administrative burden that the tax system gives you, there is also what we economists would call, and my microeconomics students have to know that, otherwise I'll fail them by May. What is the distortion of the relative price system? Now, with all the taxes that Dan just mentioned, that's exactly what happens in the US and any other country. I have had the opportunity to study, live and study in France, which is yet another statist heaven, and spent a couple of months in Denmark. So I really very much appreciate what you so correctly point at in terms of range of feasibility, in terms of a combination of a awfully heavy tax burden, way above 50% of your income, and then all the benefits of laissez-faire kind of trade and economic policies. And Denmark is to be obviously commended and celebrated as one of the most dynamic economies in the western part of Europe. But this relative price system really depends on what we want to do with taxes. Unfortunately for Bulgaria, the expected result, or at least the result that was sold to the public, is not what we got. But one example, as Dan was very vocal about the American tax system, is, and we have to see taxes as a element of our culture in terms of obviously economic policy, but political economy at large, is that this taxation on assets and the heritage tax, right? Because there is one heavy tax on anything that you will inherit from your parents or the previous generations, is meant to create, or meant to, I don't know to what account it is really successful in doing so, but is to motivate younger generations not to rely on all the wealth which will be given to them by the previous generations. The logic being, we want you to go and conquer the world. Don't rely on what you will receive from the previous generation once that generation is struck by taxes and death. Something we don't observe here in Europe, or at least we don't have the same dynamics of the tax systems. And unfortunately, we have this, say, bourgeoisie, or now nouveau riche from and oligarchs from Eastern Europe, who transmit such wealth. We may question how this wealth was accumulated in the first place, but that's yet another discussion. To younger generations, and give them responsibilities on wealth which they may not be prepared for. So Bulgaria in this case is, I'm afraid, a negative example or a disappointing example, just like the US may be seen as a questionable example of what one may label free market economy. Just as we can argue that the US are not the best example of a free market economy, so we can argue that Bulgaria is definitely not the best example of free market-based economic policies, especially in the fiscal domain. It did not bring the economic growth it was meant to do. Worse. And that's why we have, Ilya and I, when we were discussing about the topic that we'll offer to Dan, we added this word of corrupt. It did properly corrupt our understanding of what is taxed and what is praised. So obviously we tax income, we tax a flow, not a stock, but a flow of wealth. But what is more important for our community is how this wealth is generated and created. Now, in the US or any other developed country, we would see most of the economic activities being, so to speak, legal, right? They're compatible with the legal system. In Bulgaria, the very interaction, and it stems from our discussion previously here, all interaction with the administrative body of the state is potentially subject to specific arrangements. And in this part of the world, it's widespread. So it actually did help those economic agents, those actors of the Bulgarian economy who, and not only the Bulgarian economy, but say the eastern and southeastern part of Europe, who are capable of getting control of all the assets or the privatization or transmission of property rights or the new definition of property rights on assets and on control points within the economy. So now if you see the economic activity as a network, which it actually is, when you control those nodal points, you position yourself, call it rent-seeking, call it special interest, you position yourself so that you can extract in an unduly manner wealth and value. And that factored their political and economic power. Now, the other paradox in the word unusual that Ilya chose to start his presentation or discussion here today is that historically, and Dan will confirm, progressive taxation is a 20th century or late 19th century invention. Any form of taxation up to the Middle Ages and then Renaissance period was based on a flat tax. The dime, for instance, comes from there. La dîme in French, which, if I'm not mistaken, and we have a couple of professors of political science here, so they'll correct me, is a tax for the clergy, I believe. So our taxation principles, in terms of fairness, were based on one person or one household contributes on an equal manner. So it raises the question of efficiency, but also the question of equity, which for us as classical economists is a crucial point. So when Ilya and I were discussing of this dichotomy of the Bulgarian tax system, especially when it comes to personal individual income, is it fair or is it corrupt? On paper, it is fair, but in its substance, and I'm not at all advocating for a tax reform in favor of a progressive taxation, but it happened to corrupt, or at least not prevent the corruption and the alteration, and I'm afraid at least a partial destruction of the Bulgarian economy as a whole, this specific fabric, this tacit knowledge of economic activities and economic relations within this country in particular.
Thank you. Let's take some questions because I think there's some food for thought so far. Owen?
So I wanted to ask Professor Karpasanov about the fiscal situation in Bulgaria. As I understand, there's very low deficits, low debt, especially compared to a lot of Western countries. Do you think there's a correlation between the flat tax and the fiscal situation of the Bulgarian government?
Oh, there is. Well, Bulgarians, we tend to explain things with one factor only. You observe your friends or your family members, and they will always explain things with one factor only. I'll try to go beyond this cognitive limitation. Then, of course, you're welcome to join with more general observations. In terms of the macro frame of the Bulgarian state, you have a couple of institutions that come into play, and they have been into play for the last quarter of a century. The first one, obviously, is the currency board. Don't be mistaken. If there was no currency board set and still functioning 25, 26 years ago in Bulgaria, we would be eating rock here. Some of us, the vast majority of us. Those driving the Porsches, the big Mercedes, those with the private jets, they'll still be around, right? Good. But the common population would be living in way below the threshold of poverty. This brutal shock in 1996, 1997 that switched many things in Bulgaria. The major things it did switch, which we don't necessarily talk of, is the power struggle and the relation between debtors in general, creditors in general. Our creditors, internal and external, mainly external, knocked on the door being like, people, you cannot run properly your monetary policy, and for that measure, all fiscal and economic policy in the country. We need to harness your overwhelming enthusiasm in printing money and being lenient to banks of any kind. So we move from very loose budget constraints to extremely stringent financial constraints and discipline. This allowed for predictability, because the state was so much limited, and is still, luckily, so much limited in its capacity to intervene at that level in the economy. We have kept, under the pressure of our external partners, this discipline with very low debt. And when I speak of debt, it's the sovereign debt. I'm not talking about the foreign private debt, right? It's not bad. It's 60-70%. That's sustainable, right? But that's private. And some politicians, especially from populist parties, they exploit the misunderstanding of the difference between private and public foreign debt. But this framework of the monetary arrangement that we have here, and it's extremely, extremely limiting. I mean, the country cannot print new money if there is no inflow of money. Now, the link in between is not perfectly proportionate. There are some distortions there. The way the fiscal reserve is actually used, it could be proactively used through the banking division of the Bulgarian National Bank. There are a couple of tricks here and there, but in general it has held in place. The addition of the flat tax and the very low corporate tax, both of them at 10%, at a moment when we were riding the wave of the economic growth in the early 2000s, all those fantastic gains in terms of productivity, despite the dot-com crisis in 2000, 2001, it didn't hit that bad the entire, like the global economy. There were a lot of capital funds inflowing in the country because us catching up through the appreciation of the real exchange rate because of the fixed rate, we're making investment in Bulgaria in real terms more with greater return than in the core countries of Western Europe and maybe in the US. So you have a couple of very simple rules that set the macro frame, and I insist on that macro frame of the Bulgarian economy, and that has allowed us to be legitimate when we knocked on the door of the EU. The other one, and that's the worm in the fruit, are the EU funds. And all foreign capitals coming in Bulgaria. Because this macro frame is so simple and solid, it misleads a little bit. First of all, obviously, the EU authorities, when they transfer funds towards Bulgaria, suddenly they realize that there might be some misuse of funds, for real. Like 20 years, they didn't know we were doing that. We're like, where are all the Bugattis coming from? Like, gifts from above. And second, for foreign investors, the security that the pegged, or it's more than pegged, it's a fixed ad vitam, so to speak, exchange rate with the euro and the prospect of us joining the Eurozone, that's even more important, because in Argentina you had a currency board and it didn't work well at all. This misleads a little bit foreign investors and helps the government maintain a very low deficit, and they understand that they have to have at least on paper, a low deficit. Now, I need to open here another parenthesis, and Don was going to be a little bit frustrated at, jump into the discussion, but a low deficit, and any economist will tell you, does not mean fair redistribution of available resources. So we're very happy that we have a low deficit, and it helps. I mean, those institutions that we have, formal institutions that we have, they help achieve this. We're very happy that we have a low public debt. The question of the exploitation, the redistribution of the resources is made actually even more acute because of the way the Bulgarian economy is presented as one quite a stable business environment. I don't know if I really answered your question, but it's a game of mirrors, right? And you feel like you see a proper image, but it's distorted. Not only it's distorted, it's misleading in its nature.
I'll be a little bit more optimistic in the sense that Bulgaria does have a low level of debt compared to some other European countries. So even if things are a little bit distorted and never as clear as they seem, Bulgaria is in good shape in that regard compared to other countries. Having said that, I view deficits and debt as a symptom. The real issue to focus on is the underlying size of government. Government spending as a share of GDP, in my mind, is the most important fiscal variable. And controlling the growth of government spending, especially with demographic change, is absolutely critical. And probably even more critical for Bulgaria because you have a shrinking population, you have out-migration. If you have a tax and transfer welfare state, and most tax and transfer welfare states basically take money from young people and give it to the elderly. If you have fewer and fewer young people and a greater and greater share of old people, that breaks down if you don't have some sort of constraint on the growth of government. Every place I go, I tell people to copy Switzerland. Switzerland has a policy called the debt brake, but for all intents and purposes, it's actually a spending cap. Ever since it went in, the voters put it in a referendum, 84.7% of the vote in 2001. Ever since then, nominal government spending has grown by an average of 2.2% a year. And that's a remarkable performance. Government debt has fallen significantly ever since the debt brake spending cap was implemented. The burden of government spending relative to GDP has fallen, which is what, as I just said, really matters a lot. So I would build upon, I think the currency board is a good policy. If I was in Bulgaria, I would build upon it by copying Switzerland's spending cap.
Thank you. Stephen, I think you had a question.
Yes, my question is for both of you gentlemen. In terms of tax equity or tax equity reform, from your perspectives, would it be a viable option to write tax codes regardless of country, perhaps, but to write tax codes using data like actuarial tables or population numbers? So for example, maybe taxation would start out higher for younger people, but as we progress, go down. Would that be something that could be viable?
Then I'll leave it to you, and I'll add because I have already a couple of ideas. But
since people tend to make more money as they get older, the idea of a higher tax rate when you're young and a lower tax rate when you're old is probably going to run into some major political challenges. I'm a big believer in equality, but I define equality not by equality of outcomes. That's sort of a more Marxist definition. I believe in equality of opportunity and equality of law. We have a phrase etched above our Supreme Court in the United States, equal justice under law. Well, what are taxes? Taxes are laws. I want those laws to apply equally to everyone. And that's what the principles of the flat tax are. One rate applied one time with no loopholes. That's equality. Everyone's treated the same. If Bill Gates makes 1 million times more than Dan Mitchell, Bill Gates pays 1 million times more in taxes. I don't want him to be penalized for being successful, and I also don't want him to get all sorts of special loopholes because he's rich and can buy politicians. So have the laws be equal, I think, is absolutely critical. Now, by the way, this gives me an opportunity. You had talked about how, and this is a problem not just in Bulgaria, but in a lot of transition economies, some people got rich unjustly. And, well, shouldn't the tax code punish them? No. Get rid of the policies, the special favors that allow some people to get rich in the wrong way. We have that problem in the U.S. We have cronyist institutions like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, special government entities that in effect caused the housing crisis, and that echoed all around the world. Well, the people associated with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were giving themselves, again, government-created entities were giving themselves multi-million-dollar salaries. Now, because I don't like those entities and because I got angry at the corruption and the special interest nature of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, I could say, well, let's impose 99% tax rates because you had these Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac executives awarding themselves $20 million salaries. Well, the problem is yes, you'd be punishing them, but you'd be punishing every person in the economy who was earning money honestly by providing valued goods and services to consumers in a genuine, non-coercive, non-favored way. So I don't want to punish everyone for the sins of a few. I'd rather look at what are the specific sins that those people committed, and let's get rid of those policies instead.
And just to elaborate and continue on your remark, if we could predict, forecast in the most accurate manner the evolution of our population, and even go even further in our projections, but forecast the capabilities. Now, the capabilities Amartya Sen talks of, Jean-Christophe Colm in France talks of. So, tax the capabilities, but not the actual results in terms of business and economics. if we could do so, that would still rely on, unless general AI kicks in and we can really rely upon a gigantic computer giving us the answer to the most important question in the universe. We'll still rely on economic policies decided, imagined, designed, and executed by humans, mostly. And any economic policy takes between 9 months, in the best case, up to a year, half, 2 years to actually be properly implemented and start bearing fruit. So first of all, this creates a lag between the decision to implement, the actual implementation, and the result of the policy. And second, being proactive, even if it is based on I wouldn't say simple, but maybe transparent rule. Say that the further you go in life, the more is expected by you, the higher your contribution to society and community is expected to be. So you have to live up to those standards, and maybe we tax you more, right? While when you're younger, well, maybe we don't expect that much from you in terms of results. We expect more from you in terms of effort, so that you actually become a valuable, reliable citizen, active citizen of our community and society. So we are still, society invests in you before you start providing back to society. But even in that case, even with the simplest or most humane or humanistic procedure, we still introduce an element of, quite heavy element, of proactive economic policy. And then it's very easy to open backdoors, loopholes, etc., and create exceptions to a rule. As soon as we open the door for an exception to a rule, for instance, a person which for one reason or another has some health issues, cannot contribute to society as they wish they could, or any other specific case, what do we do then? What Dan says is, we have one very simple scale. What is the result of your efforts? Because after all, that's what we want to know. And just like our students, we grade them upon the result of their efforts. We don't grade them on the amount of their efforts. Sometimes I explain something, and that explanation is not very good. That often is the case. Some of my students, by some miracle, understand what I exactly wanted to say, or they just read the textbook, and they don't need to provide a lot of efforts. Others cling on what I have said in class, and they desperately try to decipher the meandering path of my ideas, and it will take them a lot of time. Most probably, those who study the textbook, economical and higher grade. But then what is it that I am expected to sanction? Hence the tax system, if the analogy works.
Let me add one thing that might be relevant to the kind of approach you're envisioning. Sweden, when they reformed their pension system back in the 1990s, in addition to putting in personal retirement accounts, they also took the government, the part of the system that was still government tax and transfer, and they made it so that the retirement age automatically goes up as lifespans increase. So built into the law is a change that I think sort of gets at part of what was in your question. Not only that, they changed the government part to a notional defined contribution system. So there was actually a much clearer link between the taxes you paid and the retirement benefits you got. So Sweden, just like Denmark, is a remarkably free market economy in ways that people don't understand, because people just look at the headline fiscal burden, which of course is still quite high.
Politically, not economically, but politically, policy that redistributes wealth from the younger generations to the older generations makes quite a lot of sense. Older people, for example, tend to vote more. Young people don't vote so much. Sorry guys, you don't vote. You can ignore the voting, but you can't ignore the consequences of the elections. You can ignore elections, you can't ignore the consequences of them. So an outright tax policy that has higher brackets for younger people, politically that wouldn't fly. It looks bad, but you can have policies that effectively do that, but you pretend that you're not doing it. So borrowing a lot of money and leaving the debt, spending it now, especially on older people, and then leaving the debt burden for the future generations, that's a very effective way of doing that without admitting that you're doing it. So we're already doing it. Essentially, we're just, well, not me, I'm not doing it, but governments are doing it, they're just being a little bit more tricky about it. There was a question at the back. Yes?
Yes, thank you if you have time. So my question is towards both of you. Ireland and Bulgaria, if we compare them, they have one of the, let's say, lowest taxation rates in Europe. And we've seen that with the Irish case, they have attracted a lot of foreign investment, especially from US companies who want some tax benefits, let's say so. But Bulgaria has not seen the same foreign investment rate. Can you explain a bit more on that topic?
Yeah, well, why is Bulgaria not a proper tax haven like Ireland?
Now,
Is it the beer?
that helps. Dan, if you don't mind, I'll quickly give just an anecdotic example for Bulgaria, and then you elaborate on the more general terms. An acquaintance of mine, a young lady, Bulgarian national, lives and works in the Netherlands. She's been there for like 10, 15 years. And so she was very adamant about having her part of her company, or the company she works for, invest in Sofia, invest in Bulgaria, have an office here, benefit from lower labor costs, have some operations rather in Sofia rather than in Rotterdam, I believe they're based. And so she builds up a fantastic business plan. She advocates about this opportunity. She presents the business plan to the senior management of the fairly small company, right? Not a large corporation. The chief of legal, a Dutch gentleman of certain knowledge credentials. I mean, like he's legal, like legitimate there. He's late for the meeting, so he storms in the meeting a bit late, excuses himself, realizes what the meeting is all about, like investing in Bulgaria. He says, Bulgaria, we don't go there. No. And I was like, that seems to be a very solid, plausible business plan here. There is no respect for the right to property in Bulgaria. We don't invest in Bulgaria. Thank you very much. Don't be losing my time. And he steps out of the meeting. Full stop. It's over. That's it. Now, of course, to that you can add the fact that, well, Irish seem to speak English.
Debatable, but...
Yes, indeed, with some accent. Yes, you may add a couple of nice drinks there, beers, stouts, etc., well, which we have too. But the problem is property rights. And you're all professors of political science, or your professor of philosophy, or even your professors in economics will tell you, do we have this? Do you have a proper system which enforces property rights? What happens when your property rights are violated? Does our community, does our society have an effective mechanism which will, first of all, prevent, impose such a discipline on all members of our community, of our society, not to consider the opportunity of spoliating, I love this Marxist terminology, spoliating members of our society? But there are plenty of other technological issues relative to the logistics of and the reliability of your supply chain, etc. Plenty. But property rights is a very good starting point in explaining this difference between the attractiveness Ireland and Bulgaria in terms of foreign direct investment.
So we're back to institutions again, right? Dan,
Yeah.
please.
I obviously I agree that property rights are important. It's also important who got there first. By the time Bulgaria was getting into the European Union and presumably then being available as a base or a platform for U.S. multinationals, Ireland had been in that business already for at least 15 years. And not only does Ireland have a low corporate tax rate, but there's also, with a lot of Americans, sort of an ethnic kinship because many Americans claim Irish ancestry, especially around St. Patrick's Day. But it goes beyond that. It's also much easier to get to Ireland. And the Irish government, if anything, goes beyond just property rights into having a favorable policy where they were actually cutting deals for Facebook and Apple where you weren't actually even paying the 12.5% Irish corporate tax rate. You were getting deals where your dividends and royalties were in effect tax-free. So it was more like a 1% tax rate effectively. So Ireland, it got there first. It does have better property rights. It also has some favoritism, but I generally applaud all those policies, but I want to give one cautionary note. I already said, and I'm going to backtrack on something I said. I already said that the most important fiscal data to focus on is government spending as a share of GDP, because that's the measure of your fiscal burden, as Milton Friedman taught us. However, in the case of Ireland, GDP is a very misleading number. What you really want to focus on is national income or gross domestic income or something like that, because Irish GDP is incredibly inflated by the paper profits of all these companies. If you look at Irish GDP per capita in an OECD ranking, Ireland's way up here. If you look at a different measure of AIC, average individual consumption, that the OECD produces, Ireland's more in the middle. So its tax policies have been very successful. Ireland has gone from being the sick man of Europe to being the Celtic tiger, but it's not quite as rich and as successful as per capita GDP figures would lead you to believe. When you look at average individual consumption numbers, yes, Ireland's much better off than it used to be, but it's not as rich as people think it is when you look at those numbers.
And if you reverse, if you take the same, the data is not reliable because obviously we're not part of the OECD, and we don't have the National Statistical Institute data is very, very questionable here in Bulgaria. But you can easily speculate that in Bulgaria it's the other way around. What our GDP per capita tells us, and what one, if we had one such a reliable average income per capita in Bulgaria is the other way around. We are actually richer than what the paper says. And a large part of this available wealth is EU funds being siphoned out from their purpose. Because, well, roads, infrastructure, etc., that's not consumption properly, right? That's not the individual consumption. While you buy lovely cars and other appliances, and it increases the economic activity on the surface.
Just a thought that I was having. I wonder if there's potential. I don't know what the Bulgarian government is doing, but I wonder if there's potential for the Bulgarian government to reach out to the Bulgarian diaspora, to the Bulgarian diaspora business communities, to perhaps do some of what the Irish diaspora has done. Of course, in practice it would be on a smaller scale, but just an idea. I know there's more questions that people might want to ask, but let's stop there for